Okay, I would like to welcome Antonietta Capitondi for her presentation today. She is presenting on the ENSO Diversity Working Group, which is wrapping up this year. And this is part of our webinar series leading up to our summit in Tucson in a couple weeks. And so with that, Antonietta, feel free to go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristen, for all your help. So we'll be talking about this ENSO Diversity Working Group, which was approved toward the end of 2012 and is in its last phase this year. The working group has been co-chaired by Ben Kertman and myself. We were very fortunate to have a very broad and I would say also diverse membership, including leading experts in ENSO in general and ENSO Diversity more specifically. And it's a membership that has also been expanding with new contributing members that were interested in joining our activities. So most of the members that you can see on the left panel are from the US, from US institutions, but we also have some international members who are actually involved with the activity of the international CLIVAR and have been very useful in bridging the dialogue between the two communities. So why did we feel the need, why there was a need for an ENSO Diversity Working Group? So it has been known for a long time that no El Niño event is the same, and this is very vividly shown in this figure here, which was prepared by Matt Newman as a suggested cover for the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society issue, and we will talk more about that later. So this figure shows the El Niño events over approximately the last 3 decades, and it's evident how the large differences in the amplitude, in the location of the largest surface temperature anomaly, and generally just in the details of the spatial pattern. And there's been increasingly recognized how these details are very important for atmospheric teleconnections and also for both local, along the Pacific, along the equatorial Pacific, and remote impacts. Also, as you can see, let's see if I can use the cursor in this panel. So these are positive event, warm events after year 2000, starting with 2002, 2003. They were all events whose anomalies were, largest anomaly were in the Central Pacific. And so there has been a lot of discussion of whether this was an indication of a changing character of ENSO possibly associated with global warming. So there was the need to try to understand this aspect. Also, it has been shown that different types of events have different predictability. In particular, it has been shown that these events with maximum anomaly in the Central Pacific, that for simplicity I will be referring to as CP events, have a different warm water volume to surface temperature relationship. So the warm water volume has been used as a predictor for warm events, for ENSO events, and so this changing relationship has actually inhibited some of the prediction of more recent events. And finally, given the large literature on the topic and on this topic, the large number of definitions and approaches used to look at ENSO diversity, and also the emphasis that has been placed by some of the literature in the existence of 2 different types of El Niño, really has motivated the need of creating a synthesis and maybe really take a look and try to better understand what the nature of ENSO diversity is. So our scientific objectives, as stated in the prospectus, was, this was a few years ago, was to examine the range of ENSO flavors with focus upon the longitudinal variation of the warming, identify the basic surface and subsurface characteristics that are robust among different data sets, assess the existence of possible and distinct precursors to the different types of event, and improve our understanding of the interplay of these different oceanic, atmospheric, and coupled feedbacks that drive different ENSO types and also impact their predictability. Our second scientific objective was to examine the performance of the CMIP-5 archives, so the climate models that participated in the CMIP-5 project in reproducing the best observational estimates of ENSO diversity and assess these projected changes. When we wrote this, the prospectus, so as I said a few years ago, we had in mind analysis of the CMIP-5 also in support of the assessment report 4 or 5 of the IPCC. Things got delayed, and so the timing didn't work quite as well. However, as also emerged by the discussion that we had at the ENSO meeting in Paris earlier this month, these activities are still very relevant for the next phase of the CMIP project, so the CMIP-6. So what have been our accomplishments? So we have started our activity. We have started with activities to engage the broader ENSO community. So at the end of 2012, we have been co-conveners of a AGU session at the AGU fall meeting entitled El Niño Southern Oscillation Continuum. And then at the beginning of February, we had the ENSO Diversity Workshop in Boulder, Colorado. And the discussion of the workshop was summarized in a report which was published by US CLIVAR. And then later that year, in 2013, we have contributed to a special issue of variations of the US CLIVAR newsletter on ENSO diversity. And then we have written a BAMS article, and we are now in the process of creating a special collection of climate dynamics whose paper are intended to address some of the remaining issues. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is to talk in more detail about the ENSO Diversity Workshop, describe the special issue of variation and the BAMS article, and say something about the special collections that we are preparing. So the ENSO Diversity Workshop, as I said, was held on 6 to 8 of February 2013 in Boulder, Colorado. It included approximately 50 participants and was organized around, we see I have all one here, and was organized about 5 major topics: the statistical characterization of ENSO diversity models and observation, dynamical processes associated with different ENSO types, predictability and prediction of different ENSO types, teleconnection and impacts, and also we try to have some paleoclimate talks to show what the paleoclimate record shows about ENSO diversity. So the workshop was intended to provide a venue for discussion and synthesis of all these different aspects, and also identify key direction for future research. So the way we have promoted the discussion is to have some overarching question for each of these sessions. So for example, for the session on dynamical processes, we had some guiding questions such as, are different ENSO flavors extreme, characterized by different leading dynamical processes? Do climate model participating in this CMIP-3 and CMIP-5 capture the differences in dynamics suggested by the observation, and do they agree among themselves? Are simple models, either statistical or dynamical, able to capture this full diversity that is seen in observation and GCMs? And if so, can they provide guidance in interpreting the more complex model? And also can they help us understand whether ENSO characteristics vary as a continuum or is characterized by discrete modes? And then how does understanding of the dynamic of ENSO diversity inform the assessment of the influence of climate change on ENSO? So we were very successful in having a very constructive discussion on all the different topics, in identify what we understand and the many open questions. And some of these topics, this aspect, have been further explored in the special issues of the US CLIVAR newsletter Variations, which was published in the summer of 2013. This issue contained 7 contributions: ENSO diversity in observations, ENSO diversity in the paleo record, ENSO diversity in climate models, extratropical precursors of ENSO flavors, the diversity of El Niño in the North American multimodal prediction system. So this was also addressing the prediction aspect, teleconnection and impact of ENSO diversity, and then we had an article on the NOAA Climate Prediction Task Force. So as a result of these different analyses and also discussions that we, as working group, we had through teleconferences, we have then further synthesized our understanding at this point for the broader scientific community in an article that was submitted to the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. The article, which is entitled "Understanding ENSO Diversity," was accepted last year. It's been available online for several months, but it will appear in print in the June 2015 issue. So our article will be featured on the cover of the magazine, and so this is a figure slightly modified from what I have shown you at the beginning. And the main goal of the article was to provide a synthesis of our understanding of ENSO diversity for the broader scientific community, and also provide the view of this diversity that can be more broader and more realistic, as emphasized maybe by some previous literature. And I would like just to give you some samples or some insights about what we included in the article. So this is the figure 1 of the paper. This was created by Emanuele Di Lorenzo for the article. So in the left panel here, you can see the extreme equatorial sea surface winter sea surface temperature anomalies over the period 1900-2013 relatively to the 1945-2013 climatology. So the gray dots are the events prior to 1945. So they are shown there just to show the full range of events, but they were not considered in terms of CP or EP events. And then the events after 1945 were further distinguished in Eastern Pacific events, which are the red dots, and Central Pacific events, the blue dots. And then some specific events, some of these extreme events are shown in the right panels. So particularly for the warm events, you can see the 97-98 events and the 2004-2005. So while we see that these red and blue dots, these different type of events, do span the extreme of this distribution, so the dots here are shown in longitude, amplitude, phase space, we can see also that they are distributed in a relatively smooth fashion. And also if we look at the overlapping area here, there is a lot of overlapping between the blue and the red dots. So this just a simple representation of this type shows us that we cannot really clearly see a bimodality. This is also confirmed by other analyses. This is, for example, an example from the SODA ocean reanalysis, which covers the period 1871-2008. This is from a paper by Guys and Ray, 2011. Again, this is now is based on this chi statistics they have developed. But again, we see here longitude and amplitude and the very large and broad spread of the events, which tend to, although we see also that it's in the Eastern Pacific that the events can be larger and weaker, while I think when we move to the Central Western Pacific, they tend to be weaker. And if we look at the PDF of this distribution, so this little bar here shows the frequency of the events in this particular longitude bin, it was found to be statistically indistinguishable from a Gaussian distribution. And a further example of this is provided by this figure that was prepared by Andrew Wittenberg, was presented at the workshop, but also is appearing in the BAMS article, and this is from 4,000 years from a control simulation of the GFDL CM2.1 model. So here now, again, we see the distribution of event in longitude and amplitude, surface temperature, peak amplitude. Now we have a very large number of events, and again, they seem to be distributed in a very smooth fashion across longitudes. Another criterion for assessing whether we can talk about really different classes or different types of event is to look at the dynamical processes that are associated with events centered at different longitudes. In particular, are dynamical processes different for events peaking in different longitudes along the equator? And in particular, it has been suggested that the Central Pacific events are not associated with recharge-discharge processes, so warm water volume in the equatorial thermocline moving in and out of the equator. So this figure here is from my study of the NCAR CCSM4 pre-industrial control integration using 500 years of disintegration, and shows the composite thermocline depth evolution for events peaking at different longitudes. So this is the top panel is for events peaking in the Eastern Pacific, the mid panel is for events in the Central Pacific, and then finally the bottom panel is for events that peaking further west. So the thermocline depth anomaly were averaged across the equator, across the Pacifics, and then are shown as a function of latitude and month. So we are going here from January. So January 1 is when the event peak occurs. So we are going from the January of that previous year to the January of the following year. So for events centered in the Eastern Pacific, if we just move along the equator here, we see a large positive anomalies a few months prior to the peak of event, indicative of a strong buildup of warm water volume along the equatorial thermocline. And then we have a very rapid change to negative anomalies, which is indicative of a discharge of this warm water volume to higher latitudes. If we now go to events that peak toward the Central Pacific, we kind of see the similar evolution, but much weaker. And then finally, when we move further toward the west, we actually see that the thermocline depth anomaly are very weak, and they don't change sign during the evolution of the event. So this means that so by looking at this process along the equator, moving from east to west, we can see that these recharge-discharge processes become progressively weaker from events peaking further west. And the more in-depth heat budget analysis essentially shows that the basic processes, the basic feedbacks that underline all these events are the same. It's just that their relative influence is geographically dependent. So for example, in the Eastern Pacific, where the thermocline is closer to the surface, the thermocline processes or meridional vertical advection is become a very important and leading term. And then in the Central Pacific, where we have very large zonal temperature gradient, mean temperature gradient, and also large anomalous zonal velocity associated with the anomalous winds, then maybe zonal advection processes may become more important. So also from the point of view of the dynamics, we don't see a real dichotomy between what happens in the Eastern or Central Western Pacific. So this discussion was included in our BAMS article, and one of our conclusions that I'm just quoting from the article itself is ENSO can be described as a complex atmosphere-ocean phenomenon that exhibits substantial variations with regionally different feedbacks, leading to a diverse continuum of realized ENSO events. So in this article, we have also identified several open questions. One is the origin of the different event type and their predictability, in particularly the precursors for different event type, the prediction of different ENSO types, and that is to do with the models that are used for prediction and with the data that are used for initialization and assimilation, and also with the intrinsic predictability of the events themselves. We also need to understand more about the teleconnections and the impacts. And I think also there is an ongoing effort also within the international CLIVAR on the influence of global warming. So the precursors topic is a very important one, and in particularly after the difficulty in predicting the 2014-15 events last year, many more precursors have been proposed in the literature, and everybody seems to have their favorite precursor. So there are several aspects that need to still be addressed. And I'm just so a few years ago, and here I'm showing a figure from Yu and Kim. This is from 2011. It was suggested that sea level pressure variation in the northern hemisphere associated with the North Pacific Oscillation, the second EOF of winter sea level pressure anomaly over the North Pacific, were very influential on the development of Central Pacific events. And in fact, what this figure shows is the lag regression of sea surface temperature anomaly on the NPO index, going from lag -10 to lag +10. And we can see the development of this anomaly that from the northeastern Pacific extend toward the equator and then slowly get established along the equator and then to expand further east. So, so while this mechanism was very suggestive, it's not clear that it can be relevant only, can be a precursor only for Central Pacific events. It is also not clear what its efficiency is. More recently, several other studies have suggested precursors from the southern hemisphere, some of which are supposed to be boosters for large El Niño. And so one question that we need to address is what is the interplay with the southern hemisphere influences. Also, other studies have shown that the initial oceanic background state is very important, and that needs to be further understood. And finally, the role of the equatorial atmospheric noise in the form of the westerly wind burst. So this is an example of the connection between the westerly wind burst and the sea surface temperature for the 1997-98 events. So all ENSO events are associated, especially all warm events are associated with the occurrence of this wind burst, and in particularly for the 1997-98, this sequence of events, including the one in the spring and then later in the summer and fall, were considered very influential in the development of this very strong El Niño. And while I think some studies seem to suggest that the lack of these events in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall, in summer and fall, that during last year was perhaps responsible for the lack of a full development of a warm event last year. Also, the westerly wind bursts are very important for ENSO diversity. Some other recent studies show that the interplay between the occurrence of these events and the initial background condition can lead to different types of ENSO events. So these are all aspects that need to be addressed, including how predictable, if these westerly wind bursts are very important, how predictable are they? So if there is some degree of predictability, or they are just entirely stochastic and unpredictable. Okay. So I'm coming now to our last endeavor, the special collection of climate dynamics, which hopefully will motivate people in addressing some of these remaining open questions. So this special collection is envisioned to include papers on several different aspects of ENSO diversity, but with particular emphasis on contributions that examine ENSO diversity in climate models and can possibly inform the definition of metrics, which is a very needed aspect. So the special collection has been approved by Climate Dynamics, and the link for submission will be available in a few weeks, and we are envisioning a 4-month time scale. So we are now in the process of soliciting the papers and just trying to establish a list of the papers that will appear in the collection. Okay, so in conclusion, I think that the working group has provided a venue for constructive and useful discussion on what ENSO is and what its different aspects and these different manifestations are. And this discussion has been held not only among the members of the community, but also I think has been involved the broader scientific community. And throughout our publication, and particularly the BAMS article, I think we have been able to maybe establish a broader and more realistic view of ENSO diversity, and this concept is continues evolving as the tropical Pacific is bringing more and more surprises in the way things develop. And we hope that our last activity, which is this special collection of climate dynamics, we can provide insight in some of the remaining open questions, hopefully identifying critical aspects of ENSO diversity and guide the community in the definition of metrics for those aspects. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Antonietta, for that nice presentation. We will open it up for Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can type that in the chat box as well. Okay, anyone have any questions for Antonietta? If not, we will go ahead and wrap up this webinar. And you can always follow up with her via email as well. Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending today, and thanks Antonietta for presenting. That is the conclusion of today's webinar, and I will send out a recording a little bit later today. We do have one more webinar coming up. For those of you who will be joining us, it's going to be next Tuesday at noon, same time, same place, and it'll be from the Southern Ocean Working Group, and I think Joel and Russell will be presenting next week. Okay, everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen.
Bye, Antonietta.